Stream.
Now.
And hi, everyone. I'm Rick Zanotti, and this is eBizChat, where it's all about business. I am joined today by my good friend and co-host, Dr. Susan Nash. How are you, Susan?
I'm fine. We have a great guest, and he's been here before, Dr. Steve Tedesco, and we'll find out if we have any updates.
Yeah, that was all about helium last time. It was actually pretty interesting, and always good to have someone come back. So here we go. Here we don't go. What's going on?
You want me to start the intro?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
This show is sponsored by Relay Corporation, Digital Learning, Corporate Video, Learning Design, and Management Consulting. Visit us at www.relatecasts.net. Thanks.
And we are back, and joining us today is Steve Tedesco. And how are you, Steve?
Good. How about yourself?
We're good. We're good. Susan, do you want to start out?
Sure. So, Steve, we've had you on as a guest here a couple of times before, and we've talked about helium and the different technologies. But I think one thing that's really interesting right now is, I guess, the world has changed a bit since you were last here. And so what's new in the world of helium, supply, demand, et cetera?
Well, we're getting into sort of the end game for a lot of helium companies this year in terms of getting to production. And the price of helium right now is $500 to $3,000 an MCF, depending where you are. For example, in South Africa, I believe the production that's occurring down there in the Witwatersrand area is at $2,000 or $3,000 an MCF. High demand, whereas in the U.S. and Canada, we're seeing generally around $500 to $700 an MCF of helium. But a lot of companies this year are going to be in the make it or break it stage, simply because they're finally getting into production. A couple companies already are producing. Since they're private, we don't know what they're doing, but we have general ideas. There's a couple public companies. They've gone silent for a month or two now, which either means they're not having a good time in getting their helium out of the gas stream, or something else is going on. Usually the public companies are more boisterous in terms of releasing data and information when everything is going well or about to go well.
Now, just for a little bit of context for those who don't know, what are the main uses, and there's a lot of uses, of helium in production, manufacturing, etc.?
Well, most people outside this niche industry think of it as for party balloons, and
Right.
it's gotten very expensive there. Several party stores, something like that, closed 29 locations a couple of years ago because of lack of helium, and that's still true.
Interesting.
But primarily, its uses in medical, welding, growing silicon and germanium chips. The helium is non-reactive with anything except under extreme high temperatures and pressures, and it doesn't turn to a solid no matter how cold it gets. So it's very much used for an atmosphere for a variety of things. The MRIs, for example, their equipment is in a helium atmosphere. It's very stable, lack of any outside effects when you run the equipment. Welding, for example, the best atmosphere to weld in is helium. Argon and nitrogen are used, but the welds are not as high quality. Military uses a lot of helium. We're in the space race. We're using a lot more helium. And then there was an article in Business Week this past week. One of the former Google owners is now going to try to bring airships back, which is probably a real waste of helium, but still, I think they're sort of cool. and they're working out of the area where Zeppelin was started in Germany.
Hmm.
But helium is in very high demand because of these growing industries. But on top of that, Russia, with its Ukrainian war, cut off about a third of the helium source in the world.
A third.
And the plant that it's coming from seems to have maintenance and production issues prior to the war. So it wasn't a reliable source of supply. But essentially, the high-tech industry is just consuming more and more helium. The new type of chips require helium to grow them in. And so Southeast Asia has become a very high demand. China's looking for sources. So we're seeing a lot of uses that weren't in existence 20, 30 years ago, but now it's critical for our way of life and the state of civilization.
That's really incredible. And your last statement that it's critical for the state of civilization really puts it in perspective. And I wonder, are there any new developments in terms of the exploration for or discoveries of helium?
Sure, there's some areas that have been opened up, like in upper Minnesota. Someone ran into a natural gas stream while coring for minerals for, I think it was for nickel. They had a flow rate, blew out the core barrel. They never found the core barrel again. And it was about 10% helium in an area where there's no sedimentary rock or normal methane natural gas. A company out of, they're traded in Canada, I believe, but they're out of Portugal. And some of the people involved were involved in Tanzania, which is another hot area. They're going to have some drilling here shortly. And then eastern Arizona's taken off, especially in a basin called the Holbrook that wasn't really looked at for a number of years, even though it had some helium production, but it's now very active. And that's where one of the companies that's not had a press release in a couple months supposedly is producing helium. So it makes you wonder if they having some issues. Maybe the gas flow isn't right or that sort of thing. Other areas are southwest Saskatchewan, southeast Alberta. It's been known for years, but the Canadians are very focused on green helium, which means the nitrogen is the host gas rather than methane or carbon dioxide. There's exploration starting in back east in Kentucky. There's been some helium wells over the years that were discovered by majors in the 60s. Now some people are trying to turn that into a new area for helium. So there's a lot of exploration going on, same with hydrogen, and for new areas and that sort of thing, but it's in early stages, and information is not being released by many people as they get their acreage together and potentially drill some wells.
So I used to live in Amarillo, and north of Amarillo is the big helium storage area.
Correct.
And it always fascinated me. Of course, that's kind of shut down now, I guess. But it occurs to me that there's a lot of. I mean, is there any left that's been left behind in the Texas Panhandle or Oklahoma Panhandle in those huge
Actually,
gas fields?
the BLM plan is up. They're trying to get it up and running again because of the price of helium. They were shutting down permanently, but they've now gone the opposite direction. There are a number of players who are in the Panhandle Hugoton area, but unfortunately, the field is very depressurized. A lot of the areas that are being explored have been explored before, and the amount of helium or gas reserves is very limited. The reservoir is very poor. But we'll continue to see this sort of exploration in these old areas because you never know if you might hit a pocket or not that's got relatively virgin reservoir pressure.
So what happens when helium disappears, if you will, or they can't get enough of it?
Well, I don't think that's the real issue. The more issue is that people have not been focused on it, and it's sort of like lithium batteries. I mean, no one was looking for lithium, and now everybody and their brother's looking for lithium. Actually, they've opened up a couple mines, and the price of lithium is plummeted. There was recently a helium conference in Colorado, and if you took all of the reserves that we saw and all the companies there, we would have more than enough helium for 100 years. So chances are a lot of those if that did happen, the price of helium would probably plummet down to $30, $40 an MMBF. And that's what people will say in the oil and gas business. What's the cure for high oil and gas prices? High oil and gas prices. We basically drill everything up, then the price falls, and everybody goes out of business, or several people do,
Yeah.
and the ones who are left sort of get these properties at cheap. There's a gentleman who's big in the helium space, and he says next year Russia will have their helium back online. But Russia, unfortunately, they're where they're extracting it. It seems like every 3 or 4 months the plant gets blown up just by poor maintenance and production or operational issues. Right now they can't sell their helium, so I don't even know if the plant's operational. But it burned down sometime last year with a major fire, wiped out the gas processing. But that's every time we turn around, when they get a helium unit back online, and a few days later it's broken again. So Russia is not dependable, but all this other helium coming on in the U.S. and Canada, they are looking in other countries. Well, like South Africa is becoming a major helium player. Canada could become a major helium player. So the cure for high helium prices in the next 2 or 3 years will be driving those prices down.
You mentioned South Africa. They're an interesting case. They've had tremendous um, energy issues this year, and it's just getting worse. They're dependent on coal for their electricity, and these coal-fired plants are falling apart. They haven't been investing in them, and they haven't done much diversification. A lot of it's attributed to corruption. But I mean, you think about it, without any kind of electricity, or electricity that's only half a day, that makes it very difficult for all countries to survive, and especially those that rely on commodities and production of materials.
That's correct. And the nice thing about the South African play, the gas that's with the helium is actually methane, biogenic methane. But the Canadian play, in many parts in Saskatchewan and Alberta, um, the problem is their host gas is nitrogen, and so they don't get free power. And the price of
Oh,
helium
okay.
drops to 200, 150 imps. They'll basically be uneconomic at present economics. It may change. Now, Ontario has and was actually the first site for helium extraction by the British. But by the time they got their plant going, the gas fields were depleted. But there's still quite a few potential gas fields there, and they have methane associated with them. Further north in Alberta, there is a helium play going on I think it's Peace River Arch area. Unfortunately, the first helium company that went in there to drill a well, their first well, they've been having problems with. They drilled a second well, and they made a major oil discovery instead. So they have cash flow from their oil. And right now, actually, having oil for most operators is more um, what they would like rather than helium, because helium takes a while to get out of the gas stream. You have to put a plant in place that takes about 9 months to 18 months to build, $3 to $5 million. And one of the big drawbacks of helium is it's like a gold deposit, where you're dealing with very small amounts in the gas stream, and you could think you have a deposit with 2% helium, maybe 2 BCF of helium gas, and then you start producing, and then 6 months later you're out of helium. It wasn't there based on original reserve estimates. And this has happened several times, where people build these plants and then they bring the gas on. There's really no helium in the gas. Um, it, we see the reservoirs, they accumulate helium at the top, and a lot of times we will go in and have 10, 20 feet of pay, but really the only upper foot, and they just don't know that until they start producing that has the helium. So it's a very somewhat high risk play, but it's very lucrative right now. I mean, there's people
Well,
looking at 0.3% helium is economic, but at $500-600 an M, yes, it is. But you hopefully will have a large area that has gas reserves. Sorry, Susan, I
well, you
didn't mean
bring
to
up
say
an
something.
interesting point. Yeah, because you bring up an interesting point. Because it sounds like, yes, it's terrible if you only have a tiny bit and it depletes, and then there's not any gas left to sell, or. But then helium is a different cat than natural gas. And so, like, let's say
Right.
if you have 20 feet of pay, 20 feet, and it's just chock full of helium, your challenges are just beginning because don't you have to use cryogenic types of plants and things like that, and especially if it has CO2. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Predominantly, we're using pressure swing absorption methods. So basically, you send the helium through um, one of these PSA units, and the pressure drops, and the helium separates out. And then you're left with actually helium and neon's considered a a contaminant, but neon
Oh,
actually goes for like $10,000 an MCF. So, it's a
yeah.
terrible thing to have. But what happens is the PSA units get out the gas or the helium gas at 90, and they make it at 98.5 to 99.5% pure. And then there's about 10 facilities around the U.S. I think they're building one in Canada now that is a cryogenic unit. And cryogenic units are in the 30, 40, 50, $100 million range. And so you send your gas via truck to these cryo units, and they basically turn it into five nines. So
Hmm.
it's 9.99%. It's as pure as you're going to get it. And they also strip out the neon, which is very sellable. But essentially, that's how the process is. And now they have these portable helium units that can be moved around. There's a company in Dallas, Texas, IACX, that builds these, and they take a piece of the pie when they extract the helium and that sort of thing.
It's fascinating.
So, yeah, but helium is one of those things. If we ban all natural gas production by 2050, we're going to have a much more serious helium problem because most of the helium we see right now is from um, fossil fuel fields, and it's probably going to continue that way for some time. Then there's Exxon's field up in Big Piney LaBarge Overthrust field in western Wyoming. It's a massive CO2 field. It's got some methane in it, but the CO2 is used primarily for secondary or tertiary recovery in several oil fields in Wyoming. And so if you can't sell that CO2, the helium, which they produce about 30% of the world's helium production, would cease to exist. So there has to be some sort of approach by both state and federal governments to continue that sort of thing. And we're seeing that here a little bit in Colorado. There's a helium play in southeast Colorado, Los Angeles Arch. It's been around. That play's been around for a while, but until the prices, it really wasn't nobody focused on it. But they have all nitrogen. But now the state, instead of treating when they drill wells, treating them like they're drilling oil and gas wells, they're treating them like they're drilling helium wells because they don't have any methane there or oil. They're treating them differently. That's the other thing is there's helium is rarely ever found with oil production. Maybe a little bit, but rarely. It's always found with natural gas. What happens is when the oil enters the reservoir, it actually pushes the helium out based on what we can tell. But there is some field or two in Arizona and New Mexico that is oil productive and has helium with it, but it's a very specific geologic setting and environment.
Now, you mentioned early on in the show that Google wants to invest, or at least one of the owners of Google wants to invest in Zeppelins again. Is that kind of like some sort of weird, interesting idea? Because in today's day and age, I would see a Zeppelin as even being more likely to blow up, even with just the amount of weaponry we have. And not even natural causes, just somebody could shoot it down pretty easily. It just doesn't seem
Well,
to make a lot of
yes, yeah.
sense.
But if you use a helium gas, you can't blow up.
Ah,
That was
okay.
the problem with Zeppelin. It was 100% hydrogen. And what the British found
Mhm.
after World War One is that if you put 10% helium with the 90% hydrogen, then it won't blow up.
Hmm.
Now, we put it full enough holes with, a 20 millimeter cannon, it's going to come down
It'll
anyway.
come down. Yeah. It'll be a
Yeah,
harsh
you
landing.
know, yeah.
Now they're
But
saving the hydrogen vehicles for the hydrogen for like little guys to drive around.
Yeah.
well, making hydrogen is not economic no matter what you do. But with the tax credits, I was just talking to somebody, it becomes very economic.
Hmm.
So,
That's
It's the same
interesting.
with
Well, there's
lithium.
definitely,
You didn't have that.
yeah, people are definitely chasing it. I mean, at least for now,
Yeah.
with the tax credits.
So, in essence, what do you see as the future of helium, at least as an investment, moving short term future, maybe long term future?
That's a very interesting question, because that's become a big question of mine. Um, you look at the companies that are trading publicly that are helium companies, their stocks have been declining for over a year. No
Hmm.
matter what announcements they put out, you know, they could have said they found the source of helium that provided for the world forever, but the stocks are trading lower. It's a very niche industry, very small group of people. The bigger oil and gas companies have except for Exxon, and that was because you had such a massive flow of CO2. Just like in Qatar, they saw that they had economic helium if they put in cryogenic plants,
Hmm.
and so it made sense to do that. But for most independents and most mid-sized companies, the thought of waiting a year or 2 years to see if it works after you spent 3 to 5, or maybe with drilling $10 or $15 million, is really hard for the oil and gas company executive to deal with that, because you can drill an oil well, and typically from the day you start drilling to when you get it on production, it's usually 3 weeks to maybe 2 or 3 months. So you have a instant somewhat gratification. Natural gas is right up there with helium to some degree, because you have to put pipelines in, you have to be close to where you can connect. And sometimes gas fields sit for 20, 30 years because they're 50 miles from the nearest pipeline and the prices don't justify it. Now, the helium prices justify it, but if you have a stranded gas field with good helium, you still got to do something with the natural gas. You can't just flare it anymore. Several states now will just charge you outrageous fines every day. They let you do it, but they'll charge you, like in the state of Colorado, 15,000 to 20, 30,000 a day. And after, I think, 2030, they're not going to allow any more flaring. So there's a whole host of different issues that make it a very unique part of the oil and gas industry. And that's why I say it's like a gold deposit. Gold deposits typically are less than 1% gold of any ore deposit. And you have to be very careful in how you mine it and process it and that sort of thing. That's why it's very similar. I mean, the future for helium is very bright, but it's just not on anybody's radar.
Hmm.
Occasionally we see articles out there, but it's not such that you're not seeing a lack of helium yet for the medical industry, but maybe once you do, you'll start to see Congress take more notice. But right now, it's sort of under the radar.
And before we leave the show, let's show your book. You have a book, and I think you're on your second version of it right now.
I'm working on a second version.
Oh, you're working on the second version, so that should be
Right.
coming
This is
out.
the first one. Yeah.
That's the first one. Okay, you can buy it on Amazon. I guess you can get it in other places too. Yeah. So definitely. Now, this is a more technical version of what to do with helium and production and everything, correct?
Well, if you were in the industry, you would think it's more of a general one. I try to bring something to whereby, a layperson who's invests in oil and gas or invests in helium could understand in general sense. I don't go into the minutia in some cases for many things at all. There is so much information out there, and I wanted somewhat of a general textbook that could be used by lay people, investors, and managers, as well as by geologists, engineers, and geophysicists.
That's great. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective on it and your knowledge. And Susan, any last questions before we wrap up?
Well, I'm really glad that you're working on a second edition, and I'm curious, what are you adding to it? Or are you just updating?
Well, I'm actually looking towards maybe trying to get it out next year after we know what a lot of these companies have done, and a lot more data will be released. Because there were several areas when I started the book that either for some reason I talked about, and then it suddenly became a play and I didn't have any idea, or other areas that are being expanded. And at least another year and then we'll see several companies will either be very productive or out of business. And we'll have more data available and more an understanding of helium systems, which is what we're sort of getting an understanding of that now, but it really wasn't discussed for the past 60 years that helium has been chased after. Actually, almost it's
That's
over
really
100
valuable.
years it's been chased. Yeah.
That's good. Well, Steve, again, a pleasure seeing you again and sharing some of this. And Susan, as always, we will be back next week with another episode. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.